So, hey everybody, welcome to Skype a Scientist Live. Today we're going to be talking all about ants. Ants are so much cooler than I realized maybe 2 years ago. The more ant people I talk to, the more obsessed I become with ants. And every time I see them now, I'm like, oh man, you don't even know what's going on under the top of the soil. So before we get started, let me just remind everyone that we are a nonprofit organization and we always need help supporting our program. And so you can do that on skypeascientist.com. You can find links to our Patreon, which is patreon.com/skypeascientist, and also our PayPal for one-time donations. That's paypal.me/skypeascientist. Also spread the word with your friends and family. Families are allowed to sign up for one-on-one matching, so one family to one scientist. If you have a type of science that you're really interested in learning about, you can absolutely sign up your family. We just ask that an adult fill out the form and then an adult be there for the session. We don't want kids on their own talking to scientists. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but just to be safe. So please spread the word there. We have like 7,000 extra slots right now because so many scientists have signed up for our program this past month. So spread the word. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Greg to introduce himself.
Hi, everybody. My name is Greg Pask. I am an insect neurobiologist, but my special focus is on ants right now. And I wanted to talk to you about ants today. I am an assistant professor at Bucknell University in Pennsylvania, but I'll soon be heading to Middlebury College in Vermont. My interest in ants is really focused on how ants can communicate with a special chemical language that only they can hear and use. And we do all sorts of fun things like see how ants behave. I have an ant colony here that I'll show you at some point soon. But really this, how can we understand and listen in on these secret conversations that make small little ants doing whatever they're doing so complex, but a simple task at the same time. So yeah, with that, I'd love to hear your questions.
Awesome. We have a lot of questions already. The first is, what's the biggest type of ant?
The biggest type of ant is from the Dinopanera family. It's only found in the genus. It's only found in South America, and it's about 3 to 4 centimeters, which is about 1.5 inches typically. And they have some pretty powerful stings as well.
Oh man. So how big are ant brains?
Ant brains tend to vary. A lot of times when you see an ant, that whole head capsule is filled with the brain. So, you have an optic, right behind the eyes, you have the optic lobes, which is where all the visual, everything that they see is coming in and being processed and transmitted. But then inside you have all sorts of other integration centers for smell, taste, visual system, all that good stuff.
Awesome. How many chemicals do ants use?
Ants use a lot of chemicals. Some of the ones that you may be familiar with, especially when you leave some crumbs out in your house. I saw there was a question about how do ants get it? Why are ants in my house? It's probably because you're leaving some small traces of food particles that ants will find. And then once that first ant, known as the scout, finds it, it will have this chemical signal that they lay in a trail to signal, as they go back to their nest to say, hey, there's some more food here. Everybody should come help me gather it. And so typically trail pheromones have 1 to a couple of compounds, but the real amount, like a lot of different chemicals that they use are found right on their outer coat. So they're covered with these really waxy molecules called cuticular hydrocarbons, but a bunch of different waxes. And ants use that for recognition. Say 2 ants of the same species, which one is in my colony, which one's not in my colony. They use these different compounds and the ratios that they exist in to see, hey, is this female ant that I found, is this part of my colony or not? And it could be a friendly greeting or an aggressive greeting.
That's so cool. So here's a question that I've never thought about and it's so cool by David. How do ants know which way a scent trail goes, like forward or backward? Like how the heck do they figure that out?
And that's a great question. They don't know when they encounter it. So oftentimes, like if you just dropped an ant in the middle of a scent trail, it could go left or right. It could follow in either direction. But typically, those ants that are going to encounter that scent trail are going to find it near their nest. And there's a lot of other nest odors that signal that, hey, this is home. So then if they're trying to follow that in a foraging, trying to find more food or whatever, they will go in the opposite direction of their nest.
Cool. The Roy family would like to know, how many ants live in one colony?
It's highly variable. So there's a lot of different species of ants. There's about 12,000 described species of ants, and some of them have really small colonies. Some of them can be maybe 50 to 200, like the ant species that I study right now. The other ants, typically your leafcutter ants, have some large colonies, around like 8 million workers in that colony. And then the biggest are these Argentine ants. They have these large super colonies where you have multiple queens, but they're all genetically related. And sometimes that can spread. It's like, millions to billions, maybe even trillions of workers. I don't know. But it's like 300 or 37,000 miles that they can span this huge super colony in Central Europe. And with an Argentine ant name, you know that this is an invasive species that is really taking hold. There's this big colony in Central or Southern Europe, and then there's a large one in Southern California as well, but not quite as large.
That's wild. So why are fire ants dangerous?
Fire ants are very aggressive when provoked, and that's one of the issues, and that they tend to kind of pop up in places that you might not expect. They are another invasive species in America, but they're so successful in this area. So one of the issues, like there was actually a scientist who made the pain index. It's called the Schmidt pain index, and he rated all these different ants, bees, and wasps for how powerful and painful their sting is when a human experiences it. And fire ants are generally pretty low on that scale, but fire ants, the aggressive nature, you're going to get a lot of those stings at once. Some people can go into anaphylactic shock from that, but otherwise it's just a lot of painful bites in rapid succession. One of the things that you have to worry about with fire ants, especially, is when they exist in like flood times, like when Hurricane Harvey hit down in Texas a couple years ago. These ants will kind of link together. Remember how I said they were really waxy? They can float on the top of the water. So ants will link together and form these nice rafts, float up. They actually put the queen and the brood, all the larvae and the eggs on top, and they just are floating on the top of the surface. Now people would see these and say, hey, what's that? And you're like my natural reaction and many other people, they would poke it with a stick. And then those ants think they found land. They climb up, and all of a sudden now you get stung a bunch.
That is a nightmare.
There's some really great videos by Adrian Smith out of NC State, has videos of like them forming a raft in real time.
That's so cool. So how did you get into ants in the first place?
I got into ants kind of in a backdoor way. I was working in a mosquito lab, and then all of a sudden there was this ant project that popped up that I was not a part of. But I really found myself hanging out with the person taking care of the ants every now and then. I'd be like, hey, what's that? How does that work? And I learned everything about the species. And then when I decided for my postdoc, after my PhD, I went and I worked on those exact ants in the same project. I'm still collaborating with my old lab, and it kind of took off from there. I found myself learning a lot more and being more and more intrigued by how ants work. They're just one of these natural mysteries where if you look at a single ant doing what it's doing, it doesn't really make sense to us. But when you think about them as a collective whole, kind of like the term is a super organism, where every single ant is like the cell inside this larger species. And that's when you really start to understand how ants work.
Cool. So here's a very important question from Jacob. Do you approve of the Antman movie?
I do approve of the Antman movie. I don't know if you saw this before, but I have been known to be referred to this, and I don't shy away from that title. I'm a big comic book nerd, and I love Marvel superheroes. The movie made really great connections to real life ant behaviors. Bullet ants, the most painful sting, are featured in the movie. There's crazy ants that tend to get into electronics and then they die, and then a lot of other ones will kind of come and think there's danger, and they bust a lot of our electronics. That was featured in the movie. And then if you remember in Ant-Man, when they're trying to go through the plumbing, that ant raft that I talk about, there's a raft of ants floating down the pipes and Ant-Man is sitting on top. Now, the one issue that they left out, I don't know how, is that almost every single ant that you see is a female. The males really don't have a role in the colony. They tend to be like flying packets of sperm that are useful for reproduction and not much more. So in Ant-Man, he refers to ants a lot of times as males, and every single ant that you're looking at is a female. So instead of Antony, it should be like Antoinette.
That's a common problem in insect movies. Like Bee Movie, I think, had the same problem. And yeah,
Yeah,
gender
sounds
bias
like
in
the same thing.
these insects. Okay, so have you personally ever encountered a bullet ant?
I have not. I would love to at a distance. They're very closely related to the species of ant that we work with. So I would love to kind of know more about that group of ants.
All right, so from Jennifer Merrifield, can you talk about some of the experiments you have done to learn about the communication of ants? I have several fourth graders from the Merrifield team listening, and they would love to hear about it.
Okay, awesome. So one of the things that we are doing in terms of our experiments right now is this one really unusual species of ant called the Indian jumping ant. And most ant colonies, if the queen is killed or dies of old age, or you just remove her artificially from the colony, the rest of the workers are going to kind of eventually die out. They might make some, produce some male eggs that will then go form new colonies. But generally, that colony is dead. Now, this species of ant, the Indian jumping ant, when the queen is removed or dies, all of a sudden they kind of look around and there's a big battle royale, a dueling of all these workers to see who will become the next next egg layer in the colony. And after about 2 weeks, they decide, and all of a sudden one has elevated to the status, which is kind of like a princess caste. So we are trying to understand kind of how are they able, I said I worked on smell and how insects can smell their environment and each other. So we're looking at how do these ants know that the queen is gone? Do they smell that she's gone? What are the actual fertility signals that the queen is giving off that all of a sudden have gone away? And now they're like, oh no, we need to have another reproductive. So I can actually show a video if that's okay, share the screen to show what these ants look like.
Before you do, let me just say, if anyone is at home needing the ASL translation, up at the top here, you should have different options for view mode. So click around in that, and once Greg switches to share screen, you'll have the option to see like me, Greg, Erin, and that's how you'll keep that ASL going. On the YouTube, it'll be no problem. You'll be able to see it.
Perfect. All right, here we go. So this is a video from Clint Pennick at NC State right now, I believe. But these are our ants. These are the Indian jumping ants. And they are deciding who will become the next reproductive for that colony. You can see that we can paint them. You can paint these ants with a little dot color code and see, which individual is who.
I love this. This is so cool. Why are they wiggling their butts?
That is usually an aggression response, where they kind of will do that to signal that they're aggressive, and then they'll do the intonation. And here we're seeing some biting. Okay. So this one getting bitten will not become the queen. And sometimes they'll carry these ants around for up to a day to police them.
Wow.
So yeah, okay, I will stop the share.
Awesome. That was super cool. So do ants have noses?
So ants don't have noses per se, but they have really sensitive antennae. Insect antennae and the ant antennae in particular are covered with all these little hairs, and some of those hairs are olfactory or smelling hairs. And the smelling hairs all have all these little holes in them, and that's kind of like the nostrils of the ant's antenna, where all these molecules, these smells, these odors from the environment can actually move through those holes in the hairs on the antenna, and then that is what that's where the sensation takes place. They're sensed once they get inside the antenna, and then they can say, "Hey, what was that smell that we just smelled?" and process it in their brains.
Cool. What is like the strongest ant and how much can they lift?
Ooh, so ants tend to be depending on the size, they can lift about 10 to 50 times their body weight on average. Um, so more that's largely because the kind of the size of their muscles relative to their body size. They can carry a lot more. Um, I'm not sure the maximum. I said the biggest ant. I could probably try to calculate it, but I don't know the number off the top of my head of like how much they can lift. Um, Typically, you're going to have multiple ants in like a really social colony. You're not going to have to rely on a single ant to lift just a little bit. It's also relative. Sometimes ants are going to be able to carry a lot more when they're on the ground, but sometimes you can see amazing images of ants carrying things while they're standing on the ceiling.
Awesome. What's your favorite type of ant?
Ooh, that's a good question. It's hard to pick. My favorite, I have a couple favorites. One of my favorites that I'll mention is the Dracula ant. So these ants, the adult ants that we think of like a normal ant, they actually can't feed on the food that they bring into the colony. They bring this food back and they rely on the larvae, all the kids, to eat the food. And then the Dracula ant, which is why they get the name, they actually pierce a little hole in the side of the larva and suck out a little bit of their blood, their hemolymph. Um, and then they heal up fine, and those larvae become adult ants, no problem. But that's the adult's main source of food, kind of indirectly through their children.
That's wild. Okay. That is so, that's crazy. Okay. So the Paul family would like to know, do ants have any other mechanisms to locate their homes other than the scent trails? For instance, if you picked up an ant and took it away from the scent trail, could it find its way home?
This is such a lovely question. Thank you for asking this. So there are most of the ants that we see kind of will rely on scent trails and just general cues about where they, the general smells of where they live. Some actually have some visual input so they can see landmarks that that remind them of home. But there's this one ant species that they've done these really extensive studies on out in the desert called the cataclysmus ant. And they actually, like you imagine you're in the desert, you tried to put down a scent trail, but it's windy and it's also hot. So that smell kind of evaporates really quickly or moves and blows with those sand particles. So these ants, they found that they actually can count their steps and integrate every step in each direction relative to the position of the sun. So what they did, this is an amazing experiment, they would let these ants move all around this whole meandering path away from their nest. And then once they found food, they would pick up those ants and move them like 10 meters in another direction. The ant would make a direct line back to where their nest would have been transposed 10 meters away. So what that means is every step that it takes in the north direction, the south direction, and they integrate all of that and say, all right, I've made this whole meandering path, now what's our direct route back? And how they figured out that they could count their steps is that they put these ants on stilts. They had 6 little stilts made for every ant foot. And they also, the converse of this was they made stumpy ants where they cut some of the leg off and made their legs shorter. And these ants are so robust, they can handle that, no problem. And the ants with the long legs walked past the colony from that transposition point. And the ants with the short legs were short because they said, hey, this was, X many steps, and we walked X many steps, but it was before and after their unfortunate procedure of cutting off their legs.
Wow. That's quite an elegant experiment aside from like the mutilation of the ants, but that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
So how good is ant eyesight, and can an ant see a person?
It all depends. That's a great question. It all depends on the species. So there's some ants that live underground their whole life. They don't even have eyes anymore. Because why have them? It's all dark. There's other species like the ones that I showed you in that video. They have really big eyes, and usually if the bigger that visual, that sensory organ is, the more important it is. The same goes for like if an antenna is really big and a lot of surface area, it's really big, really important for, smell is really important for their lifestyle. So when I walk into the ant room at my university, the ants see me. They'll kind of look up at me. They kind of look like little dogs. Sarah's seen this as well, where they'll do that abdomen shaking behavior. It's a sign of aggression, but to me, it looks like a happy dog that wants to see me. Um, and that's kind of the range that you get. Some ants aren't as visual. Like I can actually coat like a small little glass bead with this waxy pheromone signal from a non-nestmate. And these ants will attack that glass bead like it's an ant that's invading their colony, even though it looks like a glass bead. And if they were really, visually looking at it and using that sense a lot, they would be able to see that.
Very cool. What are like the big unanswered questions with ants David would like to know?
Oh, that's a good question too. One of the main ones that is really interesting across the board on ants and colonies is what are the actual, like, where is the distinction of how an ant is treated as a nestmate or a non-nestmate? So do you have to have certain compounds present and then certain chemicals present on that ant, and then that dictates that they are a non-nestmate or a nestmate, or is it the absence of chemicals? So we don't really know how these decisions get made. Diet can affect what kind of waxy pheromones these ants are putting off on their bodies. So all sorts of questions there of like, what are they thinking when they have to process all this complex information to make a decision of friend or foe?
So cool. How big is the queen ant?
The queen ant in most colonies is pretty, I'd say on average, it's about, 4 to, maybe sometimes even 10 times for like leaf cutter ants. You get really small workers and the queen is gargantuan compared to that. But it all depends. A lot of times what distinguishes a queen, morphologically is that they have a really big abdomen. So they can make all these eggs. And different species have different egg laying rates, and you can see that reflected in their abdomen size. You can also tell from the thorax, queen ants, when they were virgin queens before they mated, they have wings, and they went off on this big mating flight. So virgin queens go off on this mating flight. They find a male that's also flying around. The males have wings, and then she's collected all the sperm that she needs from this male for her whole life. And then she will go down, she'll actually chew her wings off, because subterranean life, you don't need wings anymore. And what she does, she just kind of goes underground and then will just hang out. And she's actually breaking down all the muscles that were required, that were used in the thorax for flight. She doesn't need them anymore, so she breaks them down, uses them for the energy to have that first clutch of worker eggs.
Whoa.
And that's, I can, I'll do a little camera here of, this is an ant colony that we found. We found the queen hanging around. It's hard to focus. I can share the screen in a little bit, but there's some of the ants working around. The queen's hanging around in the corner. And this is just something that I would encourage you to do yourself. You can kind of go and find some, if you find a big ant, especially some of these big carpenter ants that are in the US and elsewhere, you can find some wood ants. If you find a queen that is, has no wings anymore and she's kind of wandering off by herself, that's a rare find. My daughter, who's 5 years old, always tends to find these. And you can just have that hang out in a little test tube with some water, and she'll have her first batch of eggs, and all of a sudden you can start a nice ant colony. If that's something you're into, it can really help for home observation.
Super cool. What would you feed them?
Right now I am feeding them dead insects. I have a bunch of fruit flies, but I also have some honey water that they kind of, once it gets enough, like sometimes it accumulates water from the surface that I'm using here. And when it gets to a certain point, overnight, these 5 ants that are, this founding colony will consume it all. Sometimes there's a lot of resources online. There's a website called Ants Canada that actually has a lot of information of how to take care of ants at home. And you can get, various supplies and different substrates to make nests and everything.
Cool. How good is an ant's memory?
So in terms of being able to find their nest, the ant memory is very, very good. We kind of think of, when we compare humans to insects in terms of memory, we kind of tend to think of tasks that would not matter to an insect. But things that are really important, like, hey, I had this experience, and it was beneficial to our colony, let's keep doing it. If they find some sort of available food source that is really, packed with energy and nutrition for them, they will remember the cues very easily that are associated with that. So they remember as well as they need to, evolutionarily speaking.
Cool. Yeah. Jonah, age 7, would like to know, what are ants' main food sources?
It depends on the ant. That's a great question. So sometimes a lot of ants will tend to be scavengers of dead insects or other invertebrates that they find. Like a lot of times, if you find kind of dead insects on the ground, sometimes ants will be carrying them back to their nest to consume them. Some ants, like the ones I showed you, are predatory and they hunt live prey. Those ants that were dueling back and forth, we feed them crickets and they sting the crickets, they paralyze the crickets, and they eat them alive and feed them to their offspring. There's some ants that will actually be farmers. They can tend to colonies of other insects called aphids, and they give the aphids protection from predators like ladybugs and lacewings. And in return, the aphids actually produce the sugary secretion called honeydew that the ants consume and get energy from. Another farming ant, you guys may be familiar with them. These are leafcutter ants. They will actually cut small pieces of leaves, take them back in these really beautiful trails of ants carrying these big chunks of leaf. But the ants aren't eating the leaves. They are feeding these leaves to a fungus, and then the fungus is what the ants actually consume.
Farming ants are just the coolest. We had a lab at UConn, that John Klassen's lab, and his work is just so wild and cool. We could have an entire session just talking about those farms. They're so cool. Okay, Taryn, age 7, would like to know, what are the smallest ants, and can we see them with our eyes?
Ooh, I don't know the species of the very smallest ant, but ants can get incredibly small. I think the smallest insect is a wasp, which is closely related to an ant. But I think you can still see the smallest ants with the naked eye. One thing that is really exciting is sometimes you have this, gives some really good perspective on how the size of these colonies can be, is you can have an acorn that some sort of beetle or other insect kind of bored a hole in, grew, and then emerged. And now you have an acorn that has a hole in it. It's not going to germinate. Ants can set up an entire colony inside an acorn. So they're so small that they can have a colony of hundreds of and thousands of workers inside an excavated acorn.
That's awesome. Amelia, age 6, would like to know, what type of animals eat ants?
So not many, but obviously the one that comes to mind is an anteater, aardvarks and things like that. General scavengers, general insectivores will try to do it, but ants have all these defenses that usually predators tend to avoid them, especially because they have all these strength in numbers. And then another thing that really shows how everybody wants to be an ant. I want to be an ant. Ants, there's all these other invertebrates that mimic ants. So you can find spiders that pretend to be ants. They'll actually lift up that front pair of legs and use them as if they're antenna, and they'll walk as if they're a 6-legged ant. And you look at that and you're like, that looks like an ant. And you'll see news stories where they'll talk about ants and you look at the picture and it's a spider. There's also a lot of different leaf hoppers, which is another type of insect that basically produce these black, waxy outer coatings, and it's to make sure that they look like an ant, because looking like an ant just grants you some protection in the natural world.
That's cool. We've got Arabella, age 8, wants to know, how do humans affect ants? And I guess I'll add on to that, is climate change affecting ants at all?
Climate change and humans do impact ants a lot. Typically, if we, for humans, if we are using blanket insect sprays, like insecticides in our yards, we are impacting ants. We might not even be impacting ants directly, but we might be killing a bunch of the insects that the ants preyed upon once they died. So we're removing natural resources. A lot of the building that we do can disturb a lot of natural ant habitats. A lot of ants, like a carpenter ant, will find a home in an old tree that fell down. If we clear these out of our natural areas because they're downed, then we're removing habitats for ants, and there might be ants in there already. Um, so yeah, and rising temperatures are impacting kind of all sorts of aspects of ecology these days. There's probably better work on there's probably really good nice work on thermal regulation of ants and how that's being impacted. I'm just not as familiar with it.
Cool. Hi, Gregory, Drosophila biologist here. This is Erin Sanders. What's the average life cycle time of ants, like from egg to larva to adult, and how long do ants live?
That's a great question. So definitely they live much longer than Drosophila, and the life cycle takes longer. So for eggs, from egg to adult, for typical ants, it might range from a couple of months to, from our species, it's typically around 3 to 4 months to get to that stage. Other species, it tends to be faster. For the worker lifespan, some species, those adult workers might live for 6 months to a year. Other ones, they might be a little bit longer. Other ones might be shorter, but that's the kind of ballpark that we're looking at. Now, queens are where it really gets interesting. A queen ant, where I talked about how they get all the sperm that they need for their whole life, some queen ants have been found to live 25, 30 years, and even longer in like lab-reared settings if you give them like really nice, cushy conditions. But they basically, like that's the part that really astounds me. They live that long, and they've stored all that sperm from the males inside their body, and they're keeping it alive to produce fertilized eggs after 20 years.
That's unbelievable. Is that the longest we've seen sperm survive? 20 years?
Ooh.
I can't think of a longer one. I know cephalopods store sperm as well, but like in the month scale, not in the year scale.
Yeah, it might be the longest. I know termite queens are longer lived. Termite queens can live like 50 years, but there's actually a termite king who is constantly providing the sperm, because the termite queen lays an egg every 3 seconds.
Oh my God. That's a lot of work. My God.
And if you haven't Googled a picture of a termite queen, you should do it, because it does not look like a lifestyle that I would want to have.
Ooh, yikes. So queen, but heavy is the head that wears the crown, right?
Yes.
Yikes. So that answers, we actually had a question, does the queen ant have a king ant? So not ants, but termites, yes.
Yes.
Awesome.
Yes. And it's actually interesting in ants, bees, and wasps. If you have a unfertilized egg, that becomes a male. If you have a fertilized egg, egg and sperm meet, those all become females, and they could become future workers or future queens, or various other castes depending on what ant species you're talking about.
Cool. Sam would like to know, can leafcutter ants cut human skin?
This is such a interesting question. I know Chuck Wendig was on for the book club recently. He has a book called Invasive, that is the premise of the book, that they engineered these ants with powerful stings that have like a yeast on their, the natural yeasts on skin, and that's what they're using to eat, and they're using the skin to farm it. Yeah. I don't think that leafcutter ants would be able to get big chunks of skin. They might be able to help exfoliate.
Okay, I like that. Have you ever seen the little, there's like spas where you put your feet in with a bunch of fish and then the fish eat the dead skin?
Yeah.
It's wild. Okay. Can ants jump?
Ants can jump. So the ant species that we work with is the Indian jumping ant. They can jump up to, I think the recorded limit is like 10 body lengths. I haven't seen them jump that much, but they can jump. They actually use it as a predatory strike. One of the other kinds of species, it's actually one of the fastest moving ants. These ants called trapjaw ants. So the ant's jaws, their mandibles, they hold them out really far. And then when something triggers it, they snap them really fast together. And the speed that's been recorded with like these really high speed cameras has been 145 miles per hour.
That is impressive.
And
Um,
when this species tries to like, if there's, sometimes they can fall into antlion traps or other dangerous situations, they actually use it as an escape mechanism too. They'll like put their sensory hairs down, hit the ground, and then they smack these really fast moving jaws on the ground, and they go flying off in the distance.
that's awesome. Um, Next question from Desmond. Do we eat any parts of ants as people?
We do. So there, I'll say two examples, and that this is intentional eating of ants. I've had that lollipop that I put on the, fell on the ground. I'm like, it's still good. Um, but they're in Latin cultures and like in Mexico, there's a dish called escamole, which is ant pupa and larva all boiled with all sorts of delicious things. I've never had it. Um, and then there's another species which I believe is South American. I'm not sure, but it's called honeypot ants, and they have a certain caste that actually expands their abdomen and stores all this sugary water that they can help share and distribute within the colony. And it's like a delicacy. People find these, and they're eating them, and it's just like a nice little candy treat.
That sounds super cool. Yeah. Um, have you ever been personally bitten by an ant?
Yes, I have. Not often. The two ant species that I worked closely with were black carpenter ants and then this Indian jumping ant. The Indian jumping ant, I've only been stung once, but it's usually the bite that doesn't hurt. The bite is not the painful part. It's the bite to latch on, and then they drive their stinger under your skin and inject you with some sort of venom. The Indian jumping ant on that 4-point pain index is a 1, so it wasn't that bad. It wasn't that painful, but I definitely felt it.
Mhm.
The carpenter ants, they don't have a sting anymore. Instead, they have an acid gland, so they spray acid. So I've seen big workers bite me, and the bite, they have bigger mandibles, it hurts a little bit more, and then they spray acid in,
Oof.
and that's when it gets painful. And it's an alarm pheromone, so all the other ants smell that the acid's been sprayed, and then trying to take care of the colony for the rest of the day is very difficult.
Wow. That's cool. So Kira would like to know, do we know enough about ants to create a robo ant?
Oh, that would be a really cool thing. I think we could people have been really successful at modeling how these superorganism, these social insect colonies work with computational functions. Um, I think if you took those models and made them realistic with an actual robo ant, I think it could be it would work pretty well. You kind of have this, digital hive mind controlling their individual movements. And if they all can kind of GPS coordinate with each other, they can, communicate in different ways. Um, but you'd have to have a good, like Wi-Fi signal.
Cool. Is there anywhere that ants do not live?
Ants live everywhere except Antarctica.
Are there any insects in Antarctica? I know spiders live everywhere except Antarctica as well.
Yeah, I think there's some rare insect. I think this is taking me back to my early entomology teaching days. I think there is, but it's very rare. But
Okay.
I'm not positive. Don't
Yeah, I
quote
don't
me.
know of any, but
Yeah.
I'm a squid biologist. I don't know. June, age 6, would like to know, do ants have teeth?
Ants do not have teeth, but instead they have these different kinds of mouth parts. They kind of have like a top lip and a bottom lip that kind of helps move and position food in the mouth. Then they have the really big jaws that you see with the mandibles. But then you also have below those these maxillae that are kind of smaller jaws that might do some more of the digestion as opposed to like the grappling and grabbing that the big mandibles do.
Cool. How do ants walk up walls?
Ants and other insects walk up walls because they have, for one, they're really light, so that helps. They have these special structural pads on their feet that allow them to kind of suction cup, and there's like a little bit of like a droplet of liquid that they can exude from their feet that kind of increases the surface area and allows them to stick a little bit better. but they can pull their feet off at certain angles that when they choose, they can just, detach from the wall and continue to climb up, and even on the ceilings as well.
That's so cool. So this is a borderline silly question, but I think maybe we could get an interesting answer. So we know that ants don't live in Antarctica, but the question is, why don't ants live in Antarctica if it's named after them? But why? Do you know why Antarctica starts with ant? Like, what does the word ant mean?
My guess is it's like anti of the Arctic region.
That's what I thought too.
The
Yeah,
Arctic region maybe was discovered first, and then
reverse Arctica. Yeah, but do you know why then ants are called ants? I don't expect you to know the answer to this, but
I don't know that. I think I know like the study of ants is myrmecology, and that that's the Greek. I believe it's the Greek word for ant.
Yeah.
I'm not sure why we've come up with the term ant. That's a good question.
All right. Well, we'll just put that in our back pocket.
There's probably some dyed-in-the-wool ant biologists who'd be like, "Come on, that's an easy one."
I know why ants are called ants. Okay, so we're at 42 minutes now, so we like to wrap up around 45 minutes, and we have two questions that we ask everybody in these sessions. The first is, what is one thing you wish that everybody knew about ants? And the second is, what's something that you wish everybody knew about literally anything?
Something I wish everybody knew about ants. I really wish that everybody knew. I kind of alluded to this in the discussion, but I wish they knew that if they see a single ant and they're playing with it and they think, hey, that's doing a silly thing or a dumb thing, that it is not doing that. It's doing what it's been evolutionarily selected to do, and they are really successful. Ants are more successful than humans in colonizing this planet. They're doing well. Ants are really good at social distancing. So when an ant in the colony gets sick, those ants will smell that sickness and detect it, and they will grab that ant and move it out of the colony so it doesn't spread to the rest of the ants. So that's very pertinent in times right now. And then for things that I just want everybody to know is that everybody can be a scientist. Scientist is not an exclusive term. If you go outside and you start thinking about what you see in nature, you are doing science, starting to think how things work, making guesses, seeing if hey, you go in and you perturb this little aspect of nature and see how it recovers. You are doing experiments. This is, the founder of modern entomology is Jean-Henri Fabre. In the 1870s, he was doing amazing work in France. And I encourage all of you to kind of look into some of his work. And he did it all by just observing, not having special equipment, doing, things where they're killing insects to understand how they work. He just watched, and he just came up with amazing stories that you should all look into.
That's awesome. Okay, well, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. We learned so much cool stuff about ants today. This was awesome. So thank you everyone for joining us today. Just as a quick reminder, we are a nonprofit organization, and we totally rely on donations to keep going. And so you can support us at patreon.com/SkypeAScientist or paypal.me/SkypeAScientist. You can find Greg on the internet at
G_Pask on Twitter. And that's my top spot.
Awesome. Sounds good. Tomorrow we're talking about zoos. So we've got Jake Belair coming on tomorrow. He is just so cool. I'm pulling up the schedule right now. But yeah, he's super engaging and wonderful and has so many cool animal stories. So join us tomorrow at 11 a.m. Eastern time. And thank you, Erin, for signing for us. This was fantastic. Thank you, Greg, for so many cool stories about ants. And we'll see everybody tomorrow. Bye.
Bye.